want you to close your eyes for a second. Well, unless you're driving or operating heavy machinery. But if you can, I really want you to transport yourself back in time hundreds of years ago.
Yeah.
Way back. Imagine you are walking through a sprawling palace courtyard. And when I say sprawling, you really need to adjust your internal sense of scale here.
Right, because it's massive.
Exactly. You are walking through a complex of buildings and courtyards that is roughly the size of an entire European city. You are standing in the Kingdom of Benin in present-day southern Nigeria at its absolute zenith.
It's an incredible image.
And as you walk down these impossibly long, beautiful square galleries, you look at the massive wooden pillars supporting the roof. And nailed to those pillars from the floor all the way up to the ceiling are hundreds upon hundreds of gleaming, incredibly detailed bronze plaques. You're basically surrounded by a mirror of gold and brown metal reflecting the blinding tropical sun.
It is, it's really hard to overstate the visual and psychological impact of that space. You know, you wouldn't just be looking at architectural decoration.
Right.
You would be standing inside the physical brain of an empire. You are looking at their history, their theology, and their political hierarchy, all just cast right into metal.
Which is exactly our mission for this deep dive. Today, we're going to explore the stunning art and the intensely complex society of the Kingdom of Benin before the year 1897.
A very specific and tragic year.
Yes, because we're going to unpack the devastating British military expedition that effectively wiped that kingdom off the map. And crucially, we're going to closely examine the historical role of those iconic bronze plaques, the famous Benin Bronzes, that served as this kingdom's living, breathing archive.
We have a lot to get through.
We really do. We have encyclopedic entries, historical accounts, and the incredibly tangled provenance records of the objects themselves. But to really understand the sheer magnitude of what was lost and why these objects are so fiercely contested right now in international courts and museums, we have to start by setting the stage. We need to go back to the Edo Empire long before the British military ever set foot in the region.
Right, we have to zoom out and look at the timeline because the longevity of this civilization is just staggering. We are talking about an empire that spanned from the 14th century all the way into the 19th century.
Wow.
Yeah. That is 500 years of continuous cultural, economic, and political development.
That's massive.
To put that in perspective for you, that is a span of time equivalent to the period from the European Renaissance all the way to the Industrial Revolution. It was a highly organized, deeply structured society that evolved over half a millennium.
I'm always struck by this one specific historical account from 1668.
Oh, dapper.
Yes. A Dutch writer named Ulfert Dapper, he published a book called Description of Africa. And the funny thing is, he never actually traveled there himself.
Right, he was just aggregating reports.
Exactly. He compiled incredibly detailed observations from Dutch merchants who had been there. And the way Dapper describes the king's court is just mind-bending. He compares it to the Dutch city of Haarlem.
Which is a very specific comparison to make at that time.
Right, because in the 1660s, Haarlem wasn't some sleepy little village. It was a major, booming economic hub of the Dutch Golden Age. And Dapper says the Oba's palace is as large as Haarlem.
Just the palace complex alone.
Yeah. It's entirely surrounded by a special wall filled with magnificent houses, apartments for courtiers, and these beautiful, long, square galleries resting on wooden pillars. And the detail that the merchants couldn't stop talking about was that these pillars were covered top to bottom with cast copper depicting their war exploits and battles, kept meticulously polished.
The emphasis on the polishing is a really vital detail there. These were not, dusky relics relegated to a dark corner of a museum somewhere. They were gleaming testaments to active living power. And to understand how that power functioned, you have to understand the absolute top of this rigid societal hierarchy.
The Oba.
Yes, the Oba, or the divine king.
Because he wasn't just like a political ruler who happened to be religious, right? He was essentially considered a living god.
Absolutely. His authority was absolute and divinely ordained. His physical body was sacred, and the survival, prosperity, and security of the entire Edo society depended entirely on his mystical power and wisdom.
No pressure.
Right. And alongside him was the Eoba, the queen mother, who held immense, unprecedented political prestige.
Which was pretty rare for that time period.
Very rare. Below them, the society functioned through this vast network of specialized guilds, priests, chiefs, warriors, and foreign merchants. It was a bustling metropolis. But the way the Oba maintained control over this massive population wasn't just through military might.
This is where it gets so fascinating.
It was through the strict, non-negotiable control of physical materials.
Right, the exclusivity of materials. Because from what I read in the sources, you couldn't just wander into a local market in Benin City and buy a bronze statue for your living room, no matter how much money or trade goods you had.
Oh, not at all. Property and specific materials were strictly reserved for certain social classes. Generally speaking, only the Oba himself could own objects made of bronze and ivory.
Just those two?
Primarily, yes. He held an absolute, undisputed monopoly over those materials because they were the most difficult to obtain and required the most specialized, secretive skill to manipulate.
And coral, too, right?
Yes, coral was also a strictly royal material. Coral neck rings were a symbol of the highest nobility.
So it's essentially like the concept of elite, highly restricted designer labels today, but the designer is the divine king himself.
That's a good way to look at it.
And if you somehow manage to get your hands on a knockoff bronze cuff and wear it without his explicit permission, you aren't just committing a fashion faux pas, you are actively defying the gods. You're committing treason and sacrilege simultaneously.
That captures the psychological weight of it perfectly. The materials themselves carry deep spiritual currency. When the Oba chose to grant permission to a high-ranking individual to use a specific item.
Like one of those hanging masks.
Exactly, like a hanging mask or a bronze cuff. He wasn't just giving them a valuable piece of jewelry as a bonus for good service. He was extending a literal piece of his divine aura. He was wrapping his own spiritual authority around that chief's wrist or neck. It was a visible, undeniable, glowing marker of exactly where you stood in the cosmos of the Edo Empire.
So the metal itself is power.
Yes. By restricting who can touch, wear, or display bronze and ivory, the Oba inextricably linked his political power to the very elements of the earth. The material itself becomes synonymous with the right to rule.
That paints such a vivid picture of life before 1897. You have this massive, structured, walled city, a divine king, and a society where the very metals you interacted with were heavily regulated symbols of cosmic power.
It's a highly controlled visual environment.
Which means if bronze is the ultimate exclusive symbol of that power, we really need to look at the most spectacular, mind-bending use of it. I mean, the hundreds of plaques that line those massive palace galleries.
In the Edo language, these plaques are called ama. And to understand how they function as a living archive, you really have to visualize the physical construction.
They're rectangular, right?
They are rectangular panels, yes, and they are astonishingly thin. We are talking generally about 1/8 of an inch thick.
Wait, 1/8 of an inch?
That is roughly 3 millimeters.
You have to imagine casting molten metal into a gap no wider than 2 stacked pennies. It's almost hard to wrap your head around how difficult that is to achieve consistently without the metal cooling too fast and just ruining the cast.
It requires an absolute mastery of metallurgy. It really does. And they existed in 2 distinct architectural formats.
Okay.
In one format, the long vertical sides are folded or turned back, creating a small edge that is usually decorated with an incised guilloche pattern. You know, that intricate, intertwined, continuous ribbon design.
Right. I've seen that on a few of the museum photos.
And then in the other format, the plaques are much narrower, lacking those turned back edges, and the background design just ends abruptly, as if the metal was simply sliced off.
Which implies they weren't just making these randomly. The variation almost certainly reflects the physical architecture of the palace itself, right?
Precisely.
The size and shape of those specific wooden pillars and how the plaques had to be interlocked and fitted onto them like a massive puzzle because they were literally nailed directly through the metal into the wood.
They were structural, in a way. They belonged on those pillars, and what was depicted on them was just as calculated.
What kind of scenes are we talking about?
Well, while some represent important battles from their 16th century wars of expansion, the vast majority depict court dignitaries wearing their ceremonial dress. They portray these very static, forward-facing figures, sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs, or very frequently in small groups arranged hierarchically.
There is a very specific recurring motif here in the sources. The royal triad. You see the Obata positioned squarely in the center, and he is physically flanked by 2 assistants who are often holding him up by the arms.
Yes, the triad. And that triad isn't just an aesthetic choice, it is a vital political statement. It visually highlights the crucial support of those the king trusted in order to govern.
It's like a visual metaphor for his power structure.
Exactly. It says, the divine king is the center of the universe, but the universe is upheld by the loyalty of the court. You also constantly see The leopard.
The leopard.
The leopard is the animal that explicitly symbolizes the Oba, the fierce, cunning king of the forest representing the king of the city.
But there is another subtle, almost background detail that I found incredibly profound when reviewing the sources. On the front of most of these plaques, behind the figures, the backgrounds are incised with these foliate patterns.
Ah, yes.
These little designs bearing 1 to 4 leaves. This is the EBM, or the river leaf design. And this isn't just, floral wallpaper to fill empty space. These specific leaves were used in real life during healing rites by the priestesses of Olokun, the Edo god of the sea.
It's brilliant. Every single square inch of these plaques is loaded with theological meaning. The river leaf background spiritually grounds the political figures in the divine realm of Olokun.
So it's connecting the palace to the ocean?
It connects the Oba's terrestrial power to the vastness, wealth, and mystery of the ocean. It's a constant subliminal reminder of the deep cosmological framework of the Edo people.
And here is where my understanding of history really had to shift. Because these plaques, and even the famous standalone bronze commemorative heads, were not individual portraits.
Right. That's a common misconception.
While they have this stylized, beautiful naturalism, you aren't looking at the actual realistic face of a specific king or chief. They are archetypes. The style of the design and the specific insignia changed over the centuries, but you identify the figures not by their cheekbones or their noses, but through their clothing, their jewelry, and their emblems.
Which strictly indicate their rank and function in the court.
Right.
This really forces us to ask how history was recorded and utilized in Benin. Alongside the plaques on the pillars, those bronze heads were placed on massive ancestral altars.
Inside the palace.
Inside the palace. When a king died, his successor was required by sacred tradition to order a new bronze head to be cast of his predecessor. The new Oba had to install an altar in honor of the deceased king as a prerequisite for royal succession.
So you couldn't just take the throne.
No, you had to physically build the memory of the one who came before you.
And they would place these beautifully, intricately carved elephant tusks directly into openings cast into the top of the bronze heads, right?
Yes.
The tusks themselves would be carved with scenes from the deceased king's reign. It's basically a multimedia installation of memory.
And the belief system driving this is critical to understand. According to Edo belief, a person's head was the literal receptacle of the supernatural guide for rational behavior.
The head itself.
Yes, the head of an Oba was especially sacred because, as we established, the survival and prosperity of all Edo citizens depended entirely on his wisdom. So during annual festivals, the new king had to make ritual offerings at these sanctuaries to reinforce his own mystical power and ensure the continuation of his reign.
I'm still stuck on the idea that these aren't literal portraits, but stylized archetypes where identity is tied entirely to rank and uniform.
It's a very different way of recording history.
If that's the case, we aren't looking at a family photo album of the royals. Are we basically looking at the 16th century equivalent of a highly curated institutional org chart? Or maybe an eternal PR campaign frozen in metal?
Viewing it as a deeply spiritual PR campaign is incredibly accurate. The plaques were not meant to capture a fleeting, realistic moment in time like a photograph.
Right.
They were meant to project an eternal, unchanging, and highly organized system of power. They were an assertion of absolute order against the chaos of the outside world.
So standardizing the faces does what, exactly?
By standardizing the faces and focusing hyper-specifically on the symbols of rank, the Guild of Casters was visually reinforcing the stability of the regime. The individual human being occupying the role might age, fall ill, and pass away, but the role itself, the office, the divine authority, continues uninterrupted and unblemished.
And because they were nailed to the public galleries, kept polished and gleaming, it was a living archive that every visiting foreign merchant, every tributary chief, and every citizen passing through had to walk past.
You are physically dwarfed by the regime's stability.
But to execute this massive, continuous campaign, to cast hundreds of perfect, incredibly thin metal plaques required a level of technological and scientific genius that completely baffled the early European observers.
To understand the mechanics of this art, we really have to look at the Guild of Benin Bronze Casters.
The ones on Igun Street, right?
Yes, located on Igun Street, also known as Igun Aaron 1 Quarters. And crucially, they did not operate as independent contractors.
They weren't just taking commissions from anyone.
Not at all. They operated under strict royal decree. They lived and worked in a special area of the palace under the direct watchful control of the Oba.
which makes perfect sense based on the exclusivity of materials. If the king controls the bronze, he absolutely has to control the people who know how to shape the bronze. Yeah. The technique they mastered is called lost wax casting. I've heard the term in art history classes, but what is the actual physics of this? How do you get molten brass to form a 3 mm thick plaque with intricate river leaves on it?
Lost wax casting is a perilous, delicate process, especially at the scale and thinness the Benin Guild was achieving. First, the artist sculpts the exact desired shape, the figures, the armor, the textured backgrounds, entirely out of beeswax.
Out of wax, okay.
They then take this wax model and coat it very tightly in layers of fine liquid clay, building up a thick, solid outer mold.
So the clay perfectly captures every microscopic detail of the wax.
Yes. Then they heat the clay mold. The wax inside melts and pours out through a small channel. That is why it is called lost wax.
Ah, the wax is lost. I get it.
You are now left with a perfectly hollow clay shell, bearing the exact negative impression of the original sculpture. Then comes the most dangerous part. You have to pour molten liquid metal into that tiny hollow space.
And if you're pouring it into a gap the width of 2 pennies, the margin for error is essentially 0.
Exactly. If the clay mold is too cold when you pour the metal, the molten brass hits the cold clay, cools instantly, and seizes up, blocking the channel before the mold is filled.
Which ruins the entire piece.
Completely ruins it. But if the molten metal is too hot, the thermal shock can shatter the clay mold entirely, sending molten brass everywhere.
That sounds incredibly dangerous.
It was. The artisans had to intuitively understand thermal expansion, the exact viscosity of the molten alloy, and the ambient temperature of the air, all without modern thermometers or digital gauges. They achieved a level of quality that was truly superior. When a king was especially wealthy and powerful, he could employ a massive number of these highly specialized artisans, pushing the craft to its absolute limits.
There is a massive historical misconception about this that we absolutely must dismantle. Back in the late 19th century, European scholars, specifically men named O.M. Dalton and Charles Hercules Reed, looked at these incredible bronzes.
Oh, this is such a frustrating piece of history.
It is, because instead of acknowledging the genius of the African artists, they erroneously concluded that the Edo people must have been taught metallurgy by the Portuguese traders who arrived in the late 15th century.
It is a textbook example of how historical narratives are twisted by Eurocentrism. The 19th century European mindset simply could not fathom that an African civilization possessed this level of indigenous scientific sophistication.
Right.
It challenged their entire justification for empire. But the archaeological and historical fact-check is definitive. The Kingdom of Benin was a highly advanced hub of civilization long before the very first Portuguese ship ever appeared on the horizon. Bronze and brass casting was happening in Benin well prior to European contact.
The tradition actually derived from or was heavily influenced by the older nearby Kingdom of Ife in southwest Nigeria, right?
Yes.
Because the oral tradition states that artists from Ife, specifically the son of the Oni or sovereign of Ife, taught the Benin metalworkers the art of lost wax casting all the way back in the 13th century.
Centuries before the Portuguese arrived.
The Benin artisans absorbed that knowledge and then refined it over centuries, to the point where they were casting plaques that far surpassed the metallurgical skills of Renaissance masters in Europe.
The complexity of their work becomes even more astounding when you look at the actual molecular makeup of the materials they were using. While the world universally calls them the Benin Bronzes, scientific geochemical analysis shows they are actually mostly made of brass.
So they weren't actually bronze.
Well, technically no. Brass is an alloy of copper, zinc, and lead, whereas bronze is primarily copper and tin.
Right. I know the British Museum notes that copper alloy is the more technically appropriate museum label, but Benin Bronzes is the name etched into the public consciousness.
Exactly. But what is truly fascinating is tracking exactly where that brass came from, because it reveals a deeply interconnected, incredibly complex global economy operating long before the modern era.
Global trade in the 15th century.
Yes. By the late 15th century, Benin was actively trading with the Portuguese. Benin exported valuable goods: ivory, pepper, and, tragically, enslaved people. In exchange, one of the primary things they imported were manillas.
Manillas. These were essentially heavy brass ingots shaped like open bracelets, used as a form of standard currency along the West African coast.
Yes, brass currency.
And the Benin casters would take these imported European manillas, melt them down in their crucibles on Igun Street, and use that raw metal source for their magnificent sculptures. There is even a brilliant, almost meta piece of art, a 16th century bronze, in the Leipzig Museum of Ethnography that depicts a Portuguese soldier, and in the background, there are literal manillas cast into the bronze.
They were casting the global trade network directly into the art itself. It's incredibly sophisticated.
And modern science has recently tracked this global supply chain even further back. For a long time, historians suggested the brass in the manillas came from the Netherlands or Britain. But recent, highly sophisticated geochemical analysis testing the specific isotopes of the lead and zinc in the brass proves that the metal actually originated from the Rhineland region of Germany.
It's just staggering to think about.
I really need to pause and trace this path because it is mind-blowing. Metal is mined in the Rhineland of Germany. It is shaped into bracelets, it is transported across Europe, loaded onto Portuguese caravels, and traded down the coast of West Africa.
The logistics alone.
Right. It is acquired by the Oba of Benin in exchange for local goods and human lives. It is then handed over to a highly specialized, restricted royal guild on Igun Street. It is melted down using a 13th century indigenous lost wax technique inherited from Ife, and it is finally transformed into a masterful plaque glorifying an African divine king, which is then nailed to a massive wooden pillar in a palace the size of a European city.
It is the absolute zenith of pragmatism and cultural synthesis. The Kingdom of Benin didn't need the Europeans to teach them how to cast metal. They were already masters.
They just needed the raw materials.
Exactly. They simply capitalized on the sudden influx of raw materials brought by global trade to fuel and expand their existing brilliant artistic practices. And they did this to such a spectacular degree that art historians identify two specific golden ages in Benin metal workmanship.
When were those?
One during the reign of Oba Ezegi around 1550, and another under Oba Erasoyan from 1735 to 1750, when the workmanship achieved its absolute highest, most flawless quality.
Think about the staggering historical arrogance of those early European scholars. They looked at these masterpieces and assumed, well, they must have learned this from us, when in reality, the Benin artisans were utilizing complex intercontinental trade networks to source German metal and then using their own centuries-old indigenous techniques to cast literal circles around European Renaissance artists.
Centuries before the two cultures even made contact. By denying the indigenous genius of the Edo people, those 19th century scholars were validating the imperial ideology of their own era. If the art was European in origin, it made the subsequent conquest of the kingdom seem less like the destruction of a pure civilization and more like a civilizing mission.
Which perfectly and tragically sets the stage for the devastation that followed. Because a thriving, globally connected, highly sophisticated, and fiercely independent empire like Benin was inevitably going to clash with the aggressive, expanding British Empire of the late 19th century.
It was collision course.
We need to look at the gathering storm, specifically the fateful, incredibly tense mission of January 1897.
The geopolitical map of the 1890s is crucial here. The British Empire is actively and aggressively consolidating its control over southern Nigeria.
They wanted the resources.
Oh, absolutely. They are expanding their economic interests, specifically looking for unhindered access to palm oil and rubber, demanding compliance from local rulers, and looking to absorb independent territories into their newly formed Niger Coast Protectorate. The Kingdom of Benin was one of the last major holdouts refusing to bow to British economic dominance.
Into this powder keg steps a man named James Robert Phillips. He is the acting vice consul general of the Niger Coast Protectorate. In early 1897, he decides he is going to organize an expedition directly to Benin City.
And it wasn't a small group.
No, he sets off from the small port of Sapele with a party consisting of 6 other British officials, 2 businessmen, translators, and roughly 215 African porters.
This specific expedition is where the historical record becomes fiercely contested.
How so?
Well, the official stated aim of the British delegation, the story that was fed to the press and the public, was that they were traveling to Benin City simply to negotiate trade agreements with the ruling monarch, Oba of Benin. It was framed as a benign, peaceful diplomatic mission.
But modern scholars, like the British archaeologist and anthropologist Dan Hicks, strongly push back on that narrative. Hicks argues that this was not a peaceful diplomatic mission in any sense of the word.
Not at all.
He contends it was a premeditated reconnaissance mission, disguised as diplomacy, with the ultimate, calculated goal of overthrowing the Oba and seizing control of the kingdom's immense resources.
And the historical analysis by Philip Igbefe back in 1979 also points to a long-planned, systemic policy to depose the Oba. It wasn't an accident.
And understanding that underlying intention radically changes how we view the inciting incident of the war. Because what happened next was either a catastrophic failure of cross-cultural communication or a deliberate, calculated provocation.
Right.
The British delegation had sent word ahead of their intended visit, but they received a very clear, strict, and urgent reply from the Edo court. The journey must be delayed. No foreigner could enter the city at that time because the Ag Festival, a period of highly sacred, deeply secretive rituals, was actively being conducted.
And as we established with the altars and the plaques, the rituals in Benin weren't just symbolic pageants. They were the essential, literal mechanisms that ensured the spiritual and physical survival of the entire society. It was the absolute highest law of the land.
It was a hard boundary.
Very hard. So
Yeah.
the Edo court says, do not come right now. It is forbidden. And Phillips, along with his 200-plus entourage, they completely ignore the warnings and continue marching toward the city anyway.
It is a profound, fatal clash of worldviews. On one side, you have the British assumption of unfettered imperial access, the ingrained belief that they had the right to go anywhere, anytime to conduct their business, regardless of local sovereignty or custom.
Entitlement, really.
And on the other side, you have the deeply entrenched, non-negotiable sacred laws of the Edo court, which viewed the uninvited approach during a sacred festival as a direct existential threat. It's like showing up to the Vatican, completely uninvited, with an entourage of over 200 people, right in the middle of a highly secretive, closed papal conclave where a new pope is being chosen. You are explicitly told by the Swiss Guard, do not enter. This is a sacred, closed event under penalty of excommunication. And your response is to try to kick the ancient oak doors down anyway. What exactly did Phillips expect to happen?
Whether driven by extreme arrogance, willful ignorance, or a calculated desire to provoke a conflict that would justify a military invasion, the decision to proceed was fatal. As the British expedition approached the southern outskirts of the city, they were ambushed by Oba warriors. It was an absolute massacre.
How many survived?
Of the European contingent, only 2 men managed to escape and survive the attack.
It's a horrific event. But as you noted, regardless of what Phillips actually expected to achieve, that ambush provided the perfect, unassailable public pretext for the full, terrifying, mechanized might of the British military to descend upon Benin.
Yes, it gave them exactly the excuse they needed.
Which brings us to the darkest chapter, the sacking of Benin City in February 1897.
The speed and scale of the British retaliation is just staggering. News of the ambush reached London in just 8 days.
8 days?
Almost immediately, a massive naval punitive expedition was organized and placed under the command of Admiral Harry Rawson.
There was no drawn-out negotiation, no attempt at international mediation, no investigation into why the ambush happened. It was a swift, overwhelming military response. The British forces marched on Benin City, and they didn't just defeat the Oba's army in battle. They completely sacked, burned, and destroyed the city.
This is where we must carefully contrast the historical narratives that emerged from the ashes. The official British account, written at the time by the victors and perpetuated in textbooks for decades, framed the attack as wholly warranted and righteous.
They viewed themselves as the heroes.
They positioned it as justified retaliation for the unprovoked massacre of a peaceful, unarmed mission. Furthermore, they claimed the military expedition was a moral crusade, liberating the local populace from a reign of terror and human sacrifice orchestrated by a despotic Oba.
But when you read modern scholars like Dan Hicks, his 2020 book, The British Museum, suggests that since the 1960s, historians have increasingly understood that the expedition wasn't just a spontaneous emotional reaction to the ambush.
Right.
It was the ruthless execution of a policy that had been dictated for a long time to depose Oba of Benin and seize control of the lucrative trade routes. Hicks goes so far as to argue that the looting of Benin is not just an isolated historical incident that happened in 1897, but an enduring brutality that continues to this day.
And brutality is the appropriate word when you consider the sheer scale of the destruction, and specifically the staggering volume of the theft that occurred in the aftermath of the fighting. Once the city fell, the British victors systematically stripped the royal palace, the shrines, and the residences of the nobility. They took the physical evidence of centuries of civilization.
The numbers in the provenance records are almost hard to comprehend. We are talking about up to 10,000 individual objects.
10,000. It's a massive haul.
Hundreds of those intricate bronze plaques were literally pried off the massive wooden pillars with crowbars. The cast bronze king heads and queen mother heads were ripped off the sacred ancestral altars. Leopard figurines, intricately carved ivory tusks, bells, jewelry, ceremonial swords, all of it, ripped entirely from its context.
The cultural impact of this event is catastrophic. The British didn't just take art to admire its aesthetic value back in London. By physically removing the plaques and the ancestral heads, they systematically dismantled the spiritual, political, and historical infrastructure of the Edo Empire.
Calling it looting almost feels too small, like grabbing jewels from a bank vault. When the soldiers pried those plaques off the walls, given what we established about the plaques acting as the visual, recorded history of the regime, they weren't just taking booty. They were essentially burning down the kingdom's library, weren't they?
That's a very accurate analogy.
They literally stripped away half a millennium of recorded history.
If you destroy a civilization's archive, you sever their connection to their past, and you profoundly destabilize their future. The plaques were the memory of the state. Removing them was an act of profound, deliberate erasure. The Oba was exiled to Calabar, the kingdom was absorbed into the British protectorate, and the physical memory of their greatness was boxed up and shipped across the ocean.
It is a heavy realization.
Yeah.
And it forces us to ask a very difficult logistical question. Where does a 10,000-piece bronze and ivory library go once it has been stolen?
It gets scattered.
Right, it doesn't just disappear, it gets scattered. And that violent dispersal sets the stage for a conflict that is still raging in courtrooms, museums, and international diplomatic channels today. Let's look at the global dispersal of the bronzes and the highly contentious modern battle for restitution.
In the immediate aftermath of the 1897 expedition, the British government faced a very practical imperial problem. Military expeditions are incredibly expensive.
Right.
To pay for the cost of the punitive mission, the Foreign Commonwealth Office organized massive, immediate sales of the looted objects.
They literally sold off the kingdom's sacred history to balance the military ledgers.
Exactly. Now, the Foreign Office did allocate a large quantity, approximately 900 pieces, including a massive number of the wall plaques to the British Museum in London, which remains the home to the largest single holding in the world.
But the rest?
The rest of the massive hoard was scattered to the winds. Pieces ended up in the private estates of various British military officers and officials who were on the expedition. Many were bought at auction by other European museums, significantly institutions in Germany, France, and the Netherlands, who were eager to build their ethnographic collections.
It just got splintered.
Completely. And decades later, as collections were sold and resold, many pieces made their way into American museums and private collections. The result was a total fragmentation. By 1988, scholars estimated that perhaps as few as 50 significant pieces remained in Nigeria, while approximately 2,400 major pieces were held in European and American collections.
And as these objects moved into Western museums, the way they were perceived by the Western art world underwent a massive shift. Prior to the late 19th century, European attitudes toward African objects were incredibly dismissive.
Very prejudiced.
They were described in museum catalogs as simple, crude curiosities of pagan cults. But when the Benin Bronzes arrived in Europe, the sheer, undeniable mastery of the lost wax casting forced an immediate reckoning.
They could no longer be dismissed as primitive. The craftsmanship was too obviously brilliant. They were rapidly recognized as highly prized, masterful works of global art. And their critical acclaim rose in the 20th century, so did their financial value on the art market.
The prices are insane.
The escalation is shocking. In 1953, a bronze head sold at Sotheby's for £5,500. In 1968, Christie's sold one for £21,000. By 1984, a single plaque depicting a musician was estimated between £25,000 and £35,000.
And then you had the staggering modern figures. In 2015, a Benin bronze head was sold to a private collector for a record fee of $10 million.
$10 million.
It highlights the deeply uncomfortable, unavoidable reality that immense financial wealth is still being generated today from the violent theft of 1897.
Which brings us to the crux of the modern debate. Ever since gaining independence in 1960, Nigeria has sought the return of the bronzes. The artifacts have become the ultimate high-profile test case in the international debate over restitution and legacy of colonialism, easily comparable to the debate over the Parthenon marbles between Greece and the UK.
It is a globally watched battle, and the landscape is shifting incredibly fast. Let's break down the current state of play, because it's not a monolith. Different countries and institutions are responding in vastly different ways. Germany, for example, has made massive, unprecedented moves recently.
Yes, in a historic shift, the German government declared the restitution of looted Benin Bronzes held in their public collections. In July 2022, Germany became the first European country to sign a joint political declaration to restitute over 1,100 bronzes.
That's a huge number.
It is. On December 20, 2022, Germany formally handed over an initial batch of 20 bronzes in a ceremony in Abuja. And the German foreign minister explicitly stated that this gesture acknowledged the injustice of a colonial past.
A formal apology,
Yeah.
essentially.
The ownership rights of wider collections for major museums in cities like Berlin, Hamburg, and Cologne were transferred to Nigeria, with some display loans negotiated, so German museums could still exhibit a representative collection legally owned by Nigeria.
The Netherlands also stepped up in a major way. In 2025, Nigeria and the Netherlands concluded an agreement for the return of 119 bronzes, primarily from the National Collection in Leiden and the city of Rotterdam. It was described as the single largest return of Benin antiquities directly linked to the 1897 expedition.
And the Oba was present for that.
He was. The handover ceremony in Edo State featured the current monarch, Oba of II, who celebrated the return as a divine intervention.
We are also seeing significant movement in the United States. In 2021, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York deaccessioned and transferred two 16th century plaques back to the Nigerian National Commission for Museums and Monuments, the NCMM.
Though there's a specific reason for that return, isn't there?
Interestingly, yes. Historians note the Met likely returned these specific pieces because they were illegally removed from a Nigerian museum after independence in 1960, meaning their return was mandated by the 1970 UNESCO Convention Against Illicit Trafficking, rather than solely due to the 1897 looting.
But the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. also made a massive commitment, signing over ownership of 29 Benin Bronzes to the NCMM in October 2022. So you have Germany, the Netherlands, and major U.S. institutions actively returning objects. But then you look at the United Kingdom, the country that actually launched the 1897 expedition, and the situation is far more legally rigid.
The British Museum, which holds that massive collection of around 900 objects, remains the biggest hurdle to full restitution. Their continued legal stance is that they are protected by the British Museum Act of 1963.
What does that act do exactly?
This is an act of parliament which strictly limits the museum's ability to deaccession, sell, or return any items from its collection, regardless of how they were acquired.
So the museum leadership can't just decide to box them up. It requires literal legislation from the UK government to change the policy.
Exactly. It's out of the museum director's hands.
However, while the National Museum is blocked by Parliament, regional and university museums across the UK are taking independent action. The Horniman Museum in London unconditionally transferred ownership of its 72 Benin items back to Nigeria in 2022. The University of Aberdeen returned a bronze head, and Jesus College, Cambridge, repatriated a bronze statue of a cockerel known as Okokor.
And in a fascinating, highly symbolic diplomatic move aimed directly at the British Museum's legal refusal, the Ayas, or traditional prime minister of the Benin Kingdom, unveiled a massive 2-ton, newly cast brass plaque in 2021.
2 tons?
2 tons. Titled The Return of Oba of it was formally offered to the British Museum as a proposed swap contemporary, masterfully cast Benin art in exchange for the looted historical bronzes. It was a powerful gesture highlighting that the Igun street casting tradition is still alive, still brilliant, and still seeking justice.
It is such a complex web of international diplomacy and law,
Yeah.
but we absolutely must look at a very different perspective in this debate, one that adds a profound ethical paradox to the entire situation.
The Restitution Study Group.
Right. There is vocal legal opposition to returning the bronzes to Nigeria, and it is coming from an unexpected source, an African-American slavery reparations activist organization called the Restitution Study Group.
This introduces a profound ethical complication that requires careful consideration. The Restitution Study Group actually filed a legal petition, taking it all the way to the Supreme Court, to attempt to prevent the Smithsonian from returning their bronzes to Nigeria. Their argument does not center on the 1897 looting, but rather on the origin of the metal itself.
Right, the manillas. As we traced earlier, the Benin Kingdom actively traded enslaved Africans to the Portuguese and other European powers in exchange for the brass manillas. Those very same manillas were then melted down by the Royal Guild to cast the majestic bronze plaques and heads.
The Restitution Study Group argues that because the raw material, the brass, was purchased with the lives and freedom of enslaved people, The descendants of those enslaved people in America and the diaspora should have co-ownership over the Benin Bronzes currently held in Western museums.
It's a powerful argument.
They argue that unconditionally returning the bronzes solely to the Nigerian government or the Ibalo denies African Americans the opportunity to experience, access, and claim a vital piece of their heritage, a heritage forged literally from the currency of their ancestors' enslavement.
It is a staggering ethical paradox. How do you weigh the trauma of the 1897 colonial looting against the trauma of the transatlantic slave trade embedded in the very molecular structure of the brass?
You can't, easily.
While their legal petitions to halt the Smithsonian transfer have been denied, it highlights how deeply entangled and painful the history of these objects truly is. There are no simple moral vectors here.
And as if the international legal and ethical battles weren't complicated enough, there's a massive new twist happening right now on the ground in Nigeria regarding the Museum of West African Art, or MOIA.
MOIA. This is a development that has caused massive friction over the last 2 years. For years, the grand plan negotiated by the Benin Dialogue Group, which is a consortium including major European museums, the Nigerian government, and the Royal Court of Benin, was to return the looted bronzes so they could be displayed together in a spectacular, newly constructed museum, MOIA, right in Benin City.
It was supposed to be the Great Reunion.
European governments, including Germany, provided substantial funding and architectural support to help build this world-class institution. It was going to be the triumphant public reunion of the scattered archive.
But then in March 2023, just days before leaving office, Nigerian President Muhammadu Buhari issued a sweeping decree.
And what did the decree say?
He formally declared that all repatriated objects from the 1897 Benin expedition belong exclusively to the royal family in Benin City, specifically the current monarch, Oba II. He essentially converted the bronzes from national public heritage into the private property of the Oba.
The fallout from this decree was immediate and dramatic. Following the decree, Oba II announced his own plans to house the bronzes in a future, separate museum located directly on his private palace grounds. Consequently, MOIA, the museum everyone thought would house the Grand Reunited Collection, had to announce that it will open its doors without any authentic historical bronzes.
They had to pivot completely.
Instead, they will feature a contemporary installation by the renowned artist Yinka Shonibare, using clay replicas of the plaques.
The European reaction to the decree was intense and highly critical. Some European journalists and politicians noted that the implicit conditions under which the German government had returned the bronzes, specifically the expectation of public display and academic access, were seemingly ignored. A prominent Swiss ethnologist, Brigitte Hauser-Schäuble, went so far as to publicly call Germany's 2022 restitution policy a fiasco because the priceless art was going to private, royal ownership rather than a public, democratic museum space.
Okay, I have to push back hard on the European frustration here. I understand MOA's disappointment, but we really need to look at the underlying assumptions of that frustration. If a museum in the West is holding stolen goods, does it really matter what the original owners decide to do with them once they are returned?
It's a question of sovereignty.
Let's use a blunt analogy. If you steal my car, keep it in your garage for 100 years, and a court finally forces you to give it back to me, you don't get to dictate how I park it, who gets to drive it, or whether I keep it in a public lot or my private driveway.
Right.
The moral imperative is the return of the stolen property. What happens after the handover is strictly an internal matter for the Edo people, the Nigerian government, and the Oba to resolve. It feels incredibly paternalistic for Western nations to say, we will only return your stolen history if you display it according to our modern Western museum standards.
That is precisely the counter-argument that many restitution advocates make. Restitution, at its core, is about restoring agency. It is about righting a historical wrong. If agency is truly restored, the recipient must have the absolute autonomy to make decisions regarding their property, even if those decisions frustrate the former holders of the objects or contradict Western museological norms.
Because to the Edo court, these weren't public objects to begin with.
Exactly. To the Edo court, these objects were never meant to be democratic public art. They were always sacred, restricted royal property. The saga of Mowa and the Oba's decree proves that the story of the Benin Bronzes is not a neatly closed chapter of history. It is a live, evolving, intensely political reality.
While the physical objects remain fiercely contested, divided between private royal ownership, reluctant European vaults, and complicated new museum displays, there is an incredible attempt to reunite the collection in a completely different realm, the digital space.
Yes, the creation of Digital Benin. Launched in November 2022, this is a monumental, comprehensive online database supported by institutions worldwide. It has painstakingly cataloged over 5,000 individual artifacts scattered across more than 130 institutions in 20 different countries.
It is an incredible resource. It provides high-resolution images, detailed provenance data tracing how the object moved from 1897 to today, maps, and crucially, it provides the titles, oral history, and context in both English and the Edo language. It is a vital, necessary step in reuniting the collection virtually, allowing anyone in the world, especially the people of Benin City, to study and comprehend the sheer magnificent scope of their scattered archive, even if the physical pieces remain oceans apart.
It is a profound testament to the enduring power of the art. Despite the violence of their removal, the centuries of misattribution, and the immense complexity of their current legal status, the ama, the plaques, and the ancestral heads continue to demand our attention. They force the world to reckon with history, power, and the legacy of empire.
What an incredible, heavy, and vital journey. To quickly recap the ground we've covered in this deep dive, we started in the awe-inspiring Harlem-sized palace of the divine Oba, completely surrounded by a gleaming, living archive of bronze history. We unpacked the staggering technical and scientific genius of the Eigen Street Guild, who utilized global trade to source German brass and cast masterpieces that rivaled the Renaissance.
And the tragedy of 1897.
Right. We witnessed the tragic, devastating clash of worldviews in 1897 that led to the sacking of the city and the looting of 10,000 sacred objects. And we navigated the incredibly thorny, paradoxical, modern diplomatic battles over restitution, ownership, and the legacy of colonial theft.
It is a story that touches on almost every major discipline: art history, metallurgy, global economics, theology, military conquest, and modern international law. The Benin Bronzes are far more than just beautiful ancient sculptures. They are dense, heavy nodes of historical trauma and incredible cultural resilience.
Before we sign off, I want to leave you, the listener, with one final lingering detail from the historical sources to mull over, because I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since I read it. We spent this whole deep dive talking about the majestic bronze and brass, the materials reserved strictly and exclusively for the divine kings.
The exclusive metals.
But the sources note that local artists in Benin, who didn't have royal permission to work with bronze, also carved beautiful figures out of non-royal materials like fresh wood.
Yes, the wood carvers operating outside the Royal Guild.
To prevent the fresh wood from cracking over time, the artists would char it with fire, and then they would painstakingly rub the carved, blackened wood with palm oil and natural pigments, curing it slowly near the smoke of their homes.
It was a very specific treatment.
This specific labor-intensive process gave the wood a shiny, dark patina that perfectly, intentionally resembled rusty metal. Think about that for a second. If the everyday non-royal materials were meticulously treated by the common people to mimic the exact visual appearance of the sacred metal reserved exclusively for the divine king, what does that tell you about the absolute all-consuming psychological power of those bronzes over the entire society?
It was everything.
For the Edo people, bronze wasn't just a useful metal or an indicator of material wealth. It was the very color, the very texture of divine authority itself. It was the physical manifestation of power, so potent, so absolute, that everything else in the kingdom tried to reflect its light. Something to think about the next time you see a bronze statue in your local park or walk into a major museum holding the history of another world. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.